Welcome to the OFCCP Institute's first web chat. We figured we would do a post-mortem after the National ILG conference last week, which was held in Washington, D.C. And the three co-chairs of the Institute attended the conference. It was the largest ILG conference in the history of ILG. There were over 800 folks that participated in the conference. And I think one of the unique things, because the conference was in Washington, D.C., we had a lot of folks from OFCCP, a lot of folks from the Solicitor's Office, and others from EEOC. So I thought it was a great conference. So we thought it'd be a great idea to have an informal chat with the three of us to kind of debrief on what happened at the conference this year and what we learned. So the first thing, what was interesting is the secretary for the first time spoke at the ILG conference, and I thought that was pretty significant. Maybe, David, you can give us a recap of what Secretary Perez said.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I thought that was really interesting, historical. That is the first time the Secretary of Labor has joined an NILG meeting. I think it is reflective of the importance, obviously, that OFCCP and the Labor Department have on this meeting that has evolved, as you indicated, Dave, to a very large number. But we shouldn't overlook, in addition, I'll talk about Secretary Perez in just a moment, but we had the chair of the EEOC again. We had the senior leadership from the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, and significant number of participants, particularly from OFCCP, Solicitor's Office, EEOC, and the Justice Department there. Fabulous for the contractor community to have that opportunity to meet and get to know and hear from those regulators and enforcers. Well, of course, Secretary Perez, he sounded an interesting theme about the orchestra of opportunity, as he described it, where he really emphasized that his department is now committed to listening to federal contractors, getting their input on items. And I would say in the last 3-4 months, in my view, I think the department has indicated and demonstrated they are willing to listen to contractor concerns. And that's very important, particularly with some of the upcoming rulemakings and other efforts we have underway. I think it's a genuine offer by the department, and I think we, the contractor community, should take advantage of that and get into it.
And we'll kind of talk more about taking advantage of that. But David, I think you're right. I mean, I think the theme was that the Labor Department needs to listen, to work with stakeholders. And I think Deborah Carr from OFCCP also reiterated that please comment, give substantive comments, tell us where you disagree, and certainly that's something that we at the Institute will be doing on the Equal Pay Report, which we'll talk about in a second. But one of the common themes, I think, throughout all the sessions that we heard in regard to enforcement is compensation, and that wasn't a surprise. But one of the things, and I think we knew this was coming, OFC was going to talk about steering and the whole idea of job assignment or steering. Mickey, what do we hear?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. And first, it's always great to be with the two Davids and be able to be with you folks as well. So to pick up on Fortney's point and on the Secretary's point about listening to what the contractor community has to say, I found this to be easily the best conference ever in terms of, on the growing focus on compensation, OFCCP both sharing more information in a more specific way and exchanging information with practitioners. I had an opportunity to do a co-presentation with Pam Kukos, and it was fruitful for the contractor community to actually hear this conversation. One of the key issues in compensation, as Cohen mentioned, is steering. And steering is interesting in that it's not a new concept. It's not a new theory of discrimination, but the clothing that it wears is different now. Decades ago and up until fairly recently, if you've ever dealt with a steering issue, it was postured as a hiring case. So this is where, for example, you have two entry-level jobs. One is the production level job, where you have heavy lifting in the warehouse, no experience necessary, but you got to do some heavy lifting. And then there's also a cleanup job in the warehouse, also no experience necessary, but you don't have to do the heavy lifting. And the heavy lifting job pays $2 more an hour than the cleanup job. And what you often find, what OFCCP increasingly is focused on, is, for example, if in your warehouse, entry-level jobs that require heavier lifting disproportionately appear to be going to men, and it pays $2 more, entry-level cleanup jobs disproportionately are going to women, that can happen for one of a combination of reasons. And remember, the working assumption the OFCCP will have, and that we have, is that people want more money for the job that they work. So why would you choose the job that pays $2 less an hour than $2 more an hour, right? So the reasons that could be, one of them is that the company is, in fact, steering women into the cleanup job because there's a set of assumptions or stereotypes brought to bear by the employer, which says women can't do the heavy lifting or they don't stay in the job as long. And it's better for us to have men in that job. That's one possibility, is the employer is playing some role, whether overtly or in a more subtle way. Another possibility, and these are not mutually exclusive, is that the females disproportionately are choosing of their own accord between the heavy lifting job and the cleanup job to take the cleanup job, even though it pays less, because of the fact that it does not require the same heavy lifting. Sometimes you'll have men go into the cleanup job. Sometimes you'll have women go into the heavy lifting job, but we're in the business of looking at big statistical trends, so is the OFCCP, and oftentimes when you look at those trends emerge, they emerge in the way that I just described. That's just one scenario where steering can emerge, but the key point is this. If you as an employer are looking just within job and saying, hey, all those folks who are in the production job, the heavy lifting, they're making the same amount, regardless of gender. And separately, all of the people in the cleanup job, regardless of gender, are making the same amount. That would appear, if you put those jobs in two separate vacuums, that would appear to say there's no problem in pay. What the OFCCP is now doing is saying, if you are potentially steering these folks into different jobs, even if you're paying properly within those jobs, there's a pay issue because of the alleged steering that takes place. So it's a fascinating area, and I will tell you, whereas compensation, I think, is quite complicated for the OFCCP to dig into and to find issues, steering is in some sense like catching lightning in a bottle, because it's relatively simple to apply the framework that I just described to facts in a particular case. We've seen a lot of growth in this area during the past year in actual enforcement by OFCCP, and there was quite a lot of focus during the conference on this issue.
Well, hey, let's just have one thing, because I think Mickey's point exactly right about the new close. Keep in mind also that OFC can not only claim discrimination, right, in how the people are assigned or not assigned, they can also look at whether you have engaged in adequate good faith efforts under your affirmative action obligations. If you're underutilized, in your example, men in the lighter duty jobs, why weren't you taking steps to do that? And we've certainly seen the OFCCP demonstrate vigorous efforts directed at the affirmative action prong in addition. So it's a twofer. Steering often leads them both on discrimination and on underutilization and affirmative action enforcement.
I co-presented with Marika Litras, who's the Director of Operations, and she has confirmed that a majority of the comp cases, quote-unquote comp cases that are in the pipeline for OFCCP going forward are steering cases. So there's no question that this is a big issue for the agency. As you said, Mick, I don't think it's a compensation issue. It's a selection issue, because it's how people are being placed into jobs. Now, certainly the net effect is that maybe one group is making less than another group. So there's where the compensation comes in. But it really is a selection issue. Okay, let's move on. Interestingly enough, the ILG conference kicked off on August 6th, which was 120 days after the president sent a memo to the secretary on the pay data collection tool. And on that day, the OFCCP and OMB released a proposed rule on what's now called the Equal Pay Report. Just briefly, because I think we'll address this in more detail later on in another session, and certainly during our September event. But it is interesting what they are proposing. It's essentially an EEO1 report. So the data will be submitted and aggregated by EEO1 category, the very broad EEO1 categories. And really what we'll be reporting, because we have now seen a sample report that they have proposed, it looks like an EEO1 report. You're going to report the total number of employees by EEO category. And it's broken out males and then by race, ethnicity, and then females by race, ethnicity. We're going to be reporting W-2 earnings total and total hours. What's interesting, it is not an EEO1 report, and it's not an amendment to the EEO1 report because EEOC is working on their own report that they're piloting right now. This report, as proposed, would be submitted during the first quarter of the year going forward. So probably we're looking first quarter of 2016. It is not a snapshot. It is anybody who was on the payroll during the calendar year. There are certainly some issues with that that need to be thought through, and we'll certainly comment on that. But the other interesting thing about the report that's going to be submitted is just like the old EO survey under the Clinton administration, you have to have a certifying official who essentially signs it and says what we are submitting is accurate. And in addition, you have to certify going forward that you filed the report last year. So this is only proposed. We have until November to comment. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is significant, and it's going to happen.
Right, and I guess this is really going to be used data for enforcement. Is that right? What's the end game?
Well, it's interesting. You know, if you look at the proposed reg, it's really twofold. One, they're proposing that contractors can use this tool as a self-evaluation to determine if there are problems. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know how you do that by broad EEO category. The second thing they're saying that it's going to be used for is a way to select contractors who are most likely to be engaged in, let's say, systemic compensation discrimination, and the OFCCP would focus in on those contractors where their gap is very different from the industry gap, because they're going to be looking at this by industry. So this is going to be very interesting, you know, to see, you know, what kind of comments go in, and ultimately what's published in final form by OFCCP.
So, Cohen, quick question on that. You mentioned that the EOC is going to be piloting its own form. The National Academy of Sciences a few years back came out with a report on how best to approach this type of data collection, and it specifically emphasized the recommendation of a pilot program before going wide with this. Does OFCCP anticipate doing some type of limited pilot, or simply hitting the entire contractor community all at once with this?
Yeah, so EEOC is trying to pilot their tool. OFCCP, I think that they're just skipping over a pilot, skipping over a study, and just saying, we're going with it. Honestly, I think they're running out of time. That, you know, if you look at the amount of time left in this administration, there's not enough time for OFCCP to pilot something, study it, and then propose. So they're just going forward. Talking about going forward, we learned something new at the conference about the status of the proposed scheduling letter. Mick, tell us about that.
Well, the scheduling letter actually was proposed for changes a few years ago, and it has sat on ice in essence with the Office of Management and Budget, right? So when we have a significant change to any type of burden or reporting that employers do, OFCCP proposes that, then the OMB reviews it and makes a final determination as to whether to approve it. And we saw the OFCCP propose this. There were many changes in that proposed scheduling letter. Most noteworthy is in the compensation area, where right now your scheduling letter requires in item 11 that you present summary compensation data, really in any number of different groupings. It's at a summary level. It does not provide information at an employee-specific level. It asks for comp. Most employers provide base comp. They do not generally provide information beyond that. And in the proposed changes to the scheduling letter, which were really quite controversial at the time a few years back, OFCCP proposed in each audit at the outset with the initial submission of the plan that the employer submit detailed compensation data on an employee-specific level. Think of it in essence like a spreadsheet of data where it would provide by individual, not necessarily their name, maybe an employee identifying number, but by individual. Importantly, it would require that an employer present in separate fields of information different components of compensation, base comp, bonus, commission, other elements of compensation, as well as other pieces of data that would allow the OFCCP in every audit right from the outset to do a deep dive on an employee individual level into compensation. There are other changes as well that are significant, but that's the biggest one, and we've seen it sit on ice basically for the last couple of years. And I think the consensus among the three of us was that with all the other priorities that the OFCCP had, this was probably going to remain backburnered through the end of the fiscal year and perhaps through the end of Obama's second term. What we learned in a surprise, at least to me, at the conference is that the OFCCP anticipates getting approval for the updated scheduling letter in the coming months. Now, there was no detail provided as to whether the detailed comp in the form that I laid out and the other specific changes proposed in the scheduling letter will in fact come to fruition. There's an open issue about the new veterans and 503 regs and whether OFCCP is required to make changes to the scheduling letter in order to obtain information that's laid out in the new regulations. So stay tuned closely to this one, folks. There are so many moving parts with the agency right now that if you don't pay attention to this one and you get that next scheduling letter with a new one a few months from now, it will completely change the game in terms of how you need to respond to this audit and defend it and strategize around what you submit.
I think this is one of the most significant, in my view, this was the most significant development that I learned at this meeting, because I don't think the contractors generally were aware what the agency was doing with this letter. And it sounds like we may be looking at the revised letter as early as the first quarter of 2015. They may be using this letter for the new audits, which would make sense from their perspective. But the challenge is that many of the potential changes, and you've highlighted them for us, Mick, there is no longer an open notice and comment period. There is sort of an interesting tension between the openness that Secretary Perez pointed to and what we now see happening with this letter. The letter is over. The Labor Department, what we've learned is they've revised the letter, they've passed it over to the White House for final review and approval. That revision is not being shared with the contractor community. It's not being discussed with the contractor community. And the upshot of what that letter has will affect, conservatively, 4,000 audits every single year and will affect hundreds and potentially thousands of federal contractors and I am confident will increase the level of burden and effort that are required to respond even to the routine initial response of an OFCCP audit. This is a real significant development.
Yeah, you know, it is. And as we all know, right, the current scheduling letter is basically on a month-by-month basis.
Right.
And that scheduling letter expires at the end of the month. So it'll expire at the end of August. My point to that is we could see the new scheduling letter get approved October. They let the old one run out, and then November, 1, we could start seeing a new scheduling letter. So we don't know if there's going to be a phase-in process. So stay tuned on that. One last thing on the pay analysis groups, Mickey, quickly, you did a presentation last year, and Pam Kuko sat in on your presentation. There was a little bit back and forth, maybe a little tension. So this year, the conference decided to put the two of you together. And I still think, and I sat through your presentation, I still think that the big point of contention between OFCCP and contractors is in the area of groupings. How do you group the data? SSEG, or this new idea of a pay analysis group. So do we learn anything?
We actually did. This was fascinating. So I did. First, I don't consider there tension between Pam and me, either last year or this year. It was a robust exchange of views, which all of us want. Secretary Perez spoke about listening and communication, so I welcome that. So here's what I think in prepping with Pam Kukos for my presentation and also in presenting it. Here was the thing that I think, as a single point, employers need to focus on, and they have not been anywhere near as much so, and it's this. We traditionally think of the notion of similarly situated status. That is a concept that emerges from Title VII case law, and OFCCP has said in the past they will abide by Title VII case law as a guide. Now they're a little bit more fuzzy on the language. They say they'll abide by Title VII principles in the application of their pay enforcement initiative. But on the issue of similarly situated, here's the divide that employers need to understand. We traditionally think of, and the courts have traditionally interpreted similarly situated, in essence to mean people doing similar jobs, similar responsibilities and duties, similar experience, similar requirements coming into the job. That's how we define this. And so if Fortney and Cohen are doing different jobs, then traditionally they've been put in different groupings of similarly situated individuals for pay comparison purposes. What Pam Kuko said during her presentation, she's not being coy about this, but I think people often miss the terminology, is she's interpreting it as similarly situated for purposes of pay or purposes of pay administration. And I want you to think of that. Fortney and Cohen are doing very different jobs, but they're both exempt employees. They both sit in salary grades, different salary grades, but in salary grades that are administered in the same way. They have min, mid, max ranges. The employer's target is to bring in Fortney, Cohen, and all others in those grades at, let's say, the second quartile, just below the midpoint. And then they will have performance ratings on an annual basis where percentage increases will translate into, your performance ratings will translate into percentage increases on your base. And there will be an application of what's called compa ratio, which is really like a compression. As you get higher up in your grade, we'll take into account where you are in your grade in part with the percentages that we are providing to. That pay administration technique that I just laid out, let's assume that it's being applied the same for Fortney and Cohen. Well, in Pam Kukos' world, they are similarly situated for purposes of pay administration, even though they're very different in terms of duties, responsibilities, experience, and so forth. And that fundamental difference is one that employers must understand. And from Pam Kukos' perspective, it then allows the agency to group, for example, all of your exempt employees together insofar as pay is being administered in the same fashion to them. Whereas in my world, and I believe Title VII's world, you first figure out the precise groupings of those who are similarly situated based on similar jobs and responsibilities, and then you compare within pay. This is an issue of getting big for the agency versus what traditionally has been smaller groupings for employers. I will tell you, this is just me, not necessarily the two Davids. I do not recommend that you group people for purposes of pay administration, those who are similar. You group people similarly situated in terms of job duties and responsibilities and requirements, and that would align you much more closely with Title VII case law in comparison to what I really think is a quite novel and frankly controversial way that the agency is approaching it.
Yeah, just one note on that, an enforcement update with Marika. And the point that I made is that, last year, every single comp case that they did was by job title. So we have not seen anything with Directive 307 in terms of a conciliation agreement or a settlement. Marika's comment was, well, there's a natural lag and it's coming, but we have not seen a conciliation agreement or consent decree pushing this issue of pay analysis group. But according to Marika, we will see that going forward. Let's do a quick wrap up. And Mickey, tell us about some seminars and webinars that the Institute's doing.
Well, a couple things. First, we are seeing more change, more movement, more ferment in the area of OFCCP regulations, the changes to the rules, the scheduling letter we just discussed, and the actual enforcement and audits. I can't think of a more important time for the contractor community to stay up to date on the change that we will see significant changes from now until the end of the fiscal year, which is just a couple of months out. And with that in mind, the Institute has put together a number of different both webinars and seminars coming up. So let's see, webinar on August 26th on the 503 and the Veterans Regulations. There will be 2 seminars. So the webinar will be in a webinar format. We'll also have 2 in-person seminars, the first of which is going to be on affirmative action basics. That'll be in DC on September 9th. And then we have a 2-day fall symposium in Chicago on October 1st and 2nd. We're going to have different subject matter experts for those different specific topics. So please come join us.
Yeah, check out our website to look at our list of faculty that will be participating in that event. Fortney, tell us about the new job board we're about to launch.
Yeah, this is, I think, we're very excited about this. When we look around at how people go about getting jobs in the federal contractor compliance space, EEO compliance, affirmative action, what we find is that, of course, these are always sort of bundled up with a variety of other HR jobs. And what we consistently have heard from many different companies as they're grappling with and trying to address this surge of compliance and new regulations and so forth, they need people with expertise. They're looking to hire folks like that, and sometimes there are people that have been working in different spots that are looking for opportunities. So what we will be doing actually in September is adding on to a job board that is dedicated exclusively to EEO compliance job seekers, both individuals as well as companies with positions. It's a free service, and I think it's very exciting. We've had very strong initial interest, and that's something, please visit the website, the OFCCP Institute.org, the OFCCP Institute.org, and check it out.
So folks on the call, if you've got a compliance job, looking for something compliance, you're affirmative action specialist, manager of affirmative action, director of affirmative action, you can post your job on our website for free. And the idea is to get all of those postings in one central database and one website for free. So go check it out and post those jobs. The last thing I'll comment on is the Institute will be working on public comments on the Equal Pay Report. We've already started to do that. We've put together a consortium of contractors to work with us to study the issue, to look at it from a burden perspective, to look at it from is the tool effective? Can they use this to do self-monitoring? So we will be working with our consortium over the next couple of months to put together those comments. If you're interested in participating in that consortium, I think we have a couple spots open. And lastly, please check out our newsletter that we send out every month, keeping you up to date on things that are happening with OFCCP and EEOC. So, gentlemen, as always, thanks so much for the NILG wrap-up. See you guys soon.
Okay. Thanks, guys.